Good evening. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you to yet another BW Dialogue. Today, we'll be talking to a person who looks at your brain, looks at your mind, and tries to make a book out of it. So, let me first start by introducing our guest today evening. We have Dr. Professor John Paul Minda. He has a PhD, which I call a permanent head damage. I have one too. But let me formally introduce Professor John Paul Minda. Uh, he is a professor of psychology at the University of Western Ontario, Western University in London, Ontario. He's an award-winning lecturer. He teaches courses on cognitive psychology and thinking at undergraduate and graduate level. He's also an author. He's written textbooks in the past. But today we are going to talk to him about a book which is called How to Think. Uh, and in his psychology research, he seeks to understand how people organize their experiences into categories and concepts and how conceptual structures influence thinking. His experimental psychology labs in Western interdisciplinary research building, along with the other members of the Brain and Mind Institute. His research team consists of graduate students, honor students, and research assistants, and it is funded by several grants from the Canadian government and by grants from Western University. So let me welcome Professor John Paul Minda to the BW Dialogue. We're going to talk to him about his latest book. It's called How to Think. So thank you, Paul, for joining us. I know it's early morning for you there, so it's late evening for us in India. Welcome, and let me start by asking you to show a copy of your book. You have it in your hand.
I do. Thank you, Dr. Batra, for the introduction. So yeah, I think on my screen, it looks like it's backwards. Maybe it's forwards on your screen. I never really know
No,
what
it's
people are
perfect.
looking at on the other side.
It's a lovely cover, I was
Yeah.
telling you that before I started the conversation. I'll come into the book and what's inside the book and in your area of research on mind, on thinking, on the brain. But let me start by asking you, how were the last 17 months for you, both personally and professionally?
Thanks for the question. So yeah, the last 17 months, like a lot of people, I mean, pretty much everyone all over the world, we've been sort of dealing with the ups and downs of COVID, right? I mean, that's the biggest issue, which was not actually on the scene when I began writing this book. So I started writing it, sort of conceived the ideas and came up with some of put the proposal forward. I think at the beginning of towards the end of 2018. I really didn't start writing most of this until early 2019. So the idea of writing during a pandemic or the impact of COVID wasn't even something I had considered until I was about halfway through with this. So yeah, it's been good and bad, professionally and personally. We've been able to make do by doing a lot of stuff online. A lot of universities, certainly in Canada and the United States, I guess really all over the world, have done a lot of stuff online. So for us, we were sent home and transitioned to online instruction in March 2020. And that's like 495 days of a lot of teaching online and research online. And although things have eased up a bit and we're planning to do our fall term here, in person, it's still been a bit of a challenge, right? So we can do a lot of our work online, but teaching online is much more difficult. So actually, I talk about this in the final chapter of my text when I talk about the challenges of doing things on Zoom. Now, this is a great example of what some of the benefits of the Zoom and sort of video conferencing technology. The fact that we can do this interview where it's 9:30 in the morning for me and 7 p.m. for you, two different parts of the world, and we can stream it live. That's pretty incredible as far as I'm concerned. But teaching in taking courses online can be a much bigger challenge. One of the things I noticed, both for myself, but also for my students, and in fact, even my two daughters who are in university and high school here, is when you're taking a lot of courses or doing a lot of work online on Zoom, everything starts to seem the same, right? So you're sitting at the same desk and looking at the same computer for maybe 4 different classes with different topics, but you're always sitting in the same place and doing them at the different times throughout the day. And those of you that are working remotely probably experience this too, right? I mean, what would normally be a work day starts to spread out, and you do work early in the mornings. Then maybe you do some online shopping, or you read the news, then you're working a little bit more, then you're doing other stuff, and it all kind of starts to look the same and kind of blend in. And that doesn't work very well with the way our brains try to tag different aspects of the environment to remember things, right? So if you're using cues of the environment to remember different things, doing everything online where all of the cues kind of seem the same can be counterproductive. So that's been a challenge over the last 17 months, is trying to keep things straight. So I'm looking forward to being able to get back on campus, teaching in person, even though, we're all a little nervous about that too, because I'm going to be teaching one of the classes I teach has 300 students in it, right? So it'll be 300 students in a large lecture hall, 2 hours a week, 2 hours twice a week. So it's 4 hours a week. That's a lot of time in person, and I haven't done that for a while. And of course, with the possibility of indoor transmission and a 4th wave of COVID, there's a little bit of anxiety there. But we've been trying to get everybody to get their vaccines so that we can do it. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think we'll be okay. Yeah, it's been an interesting 17 months to say the least.
Yeah, Paul, and I was talking to the director of a leading business school 3 hours before you, and I asked him about the word used in education these days is hybrid. A bit of classroom and a bit of online, but it's not the same as being in the classroom. It's not the same.
It's definitely not the same. I mean, it's not the same experience. There's a lot to be said for a live lecture, right? I mean, you've got a lot of back and forth with the instructor. The instructor, if they're a good lecturer, they can pivot to different topics depending on what students bring up. They can address current events. They can gauge whether or not their audience is following along. I mean, I did my lectures live, sort of like this. I did them live online on Zoom this past winter. I recorded them so that students could watch them elsewhere, because I had students in lots of places all over the world. So I wanted to make sure that wherever they were, whether they were in different, and in fact, I had several students who were taking the class from back home in India, students in China, students in lots of parts of North America, different time zones in Canada. So they had to be able to watch them, but I also did them live because I needed to do them anyway. So the majority of the students watched online live, but I couldn't see them, right? I couldn't see if they were paying attention. I couldn't see if they were following along. It helps a little bit if they can reply on the chat in Zoom, but yeah, it's definitely not the same. There's a lot to be said for that kind of live interaction. Makes a better experience. I think it's better for the learner
I agree with
to
you.
be able to do it that way.
Yeah, Paul,
so yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, Paul, the funny part is not only the professors and the teachers are looking forward to being back in a traditional classroom, if I may call it. The students are looking forward to it more. I'm the chairman of my alumni and I'm on the board of my business school. The new batch joinees actually called me and said, can you request the college to start physical classes ASAP? And, so it's not just the professors, but the students are looking forward to that. Now, let me dive into what we are discussing today, which is your book. First of all, why this book? Why now? And how did you get the idea of writing this book? I know I explained to our viewers and our readers your background. And why do we need a book on how to think?
Yeah, those are great questions. So let me give you sort of I can start with maybe the background. So I'll tell you why I decided to write this book. And then I'll talk a little bit about why I think it's a good book to have out now. So I do talk about this at the very beginning in the introduction. I've been teaching on these topics for almost 20 years. So my area of expertise specifically as a researcher is on concepts and categories and how people classify things into different groups. So that's my specific area of expertise. But I'm interested sort of broadly in how concepts are used, how people use concepts to make decisions and solve problems and guide their behaviors. And so I started teaching courses on thinking. teaching courses on inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning and problem solving and decision making. And I also teach a larger undergraduate course on cognitive psychology in general. And that covers everything from perception and attention. And I really wanted to be able to take some of the things that I talk about in a lecture format and write about them in a way that's a little bit more broadly accessible. A lot of students have actually told me this, and this is for both of my courses, that what they've learned in my courses has really changed the way they think about things. And this is particularly true of the course that I teach called The Psychology of Thinking. And I've written a textbook for that. It's in its second edition. And it's been a really great course to teach. It's the first one I started teaching in university. I teach it every year, several times a year. Students take it and have learned things to help them prepare for law school, medical school, business school, marketing, all sorts of things. And they've told me that it really changes the way they think about things. And I thought, well, if I can do that in a university, I'd like to be able to do that in sort of a mass market, popular book that I think people would really like to read and find out more about how they think. So, why this book? I think people do need a book on, well, I think there's a good market or I think there's a good need for a book on how people think. There's a lot of books on how people think, right? I mean, there's some really, I would say every month I see new books on critical thinking, new books on heuristics and biases. That's a really big topic, right? I mean, one of the big ones that came out a few years ago, Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. I talk a lot about some of those ideas in my book too. One of the things those kinds of books emphasize is sort of the outcomes, how we make decisions and how we fail to make decisions. That's a big topic too, right? How people make mistakes, how we avoid biases and how we can overcome cognitive biases and improve things. And I think that's an important part of it, but I wanted to go a lot deeper into the cognitive psychology of it. So why does our memory work the way it does? And how is that beneficial? And how does the same architecture of our memory also lead us to make mistakes? And one of the underlying themes that I've tried to stress in this book is that the same things that sometimes lead us to occasionally make mistakes, to remember the wrong thing or make the wrong decision, are really just a byproduct of a system that works really well. Most of the time we remember the right things. Most of the time we make the right decisions. Occasionally we make mistakes, but it all comes from the same place, right? So that's why I wanted to write it. I wanted to sort of take that message that I think I get across in my lectures and maybe make it something that people would read outside of a university classroom.
I've enjoyed reading it. Yeah, I've enjoyed reading it. But your subtitle under How to Think is Understanding the Way We Decide, Remember, and Make Sense of the World. Please elaborate on this.
Yeah, so what I think about that is that's kind of when most of us think about thinking, we think about a mental process, right? You sort of imagine that you're maybe thinking out, talking to yourself or imagining things or working out problems in your head. But really what we want to measure is sort of the outcome of your thinking. What do you want to do with your thoughts? So deciding, remembering, and making sense of the world, those are kind of the behavioral outcomes of thinking, right? That's what you want to do. So if thinking is using our brain and our mental processes, we want to be able to accomplish goals. We want to be able to make the right decision. We want to be able to choose the right object or choose the right person to be with or choose the right words to explain something. So, we're having this dialogue right now. Every so often you'll notice I'll pause and think about what I want to say next because I want to choose the right words. They don't always come out exactly the right way. We want to choose the right questions. So those are the outcomes and those are the goals. And I wanted to help people understand how we get there. So what are the things that we use when we make decisions? And of course, one of the things I talk about is we use our vast experiences and memories to make decisions. And the same thing with problem solving. So understanding how the way we decide, remember, and make sense of the world means understanding the way the brain works and the way the mind works, the way memory and attention and perception work. So those basic fundamental processes work together to help us make decisions to accomplish goals.
Thank you so much. And Paul, I want to ask you that the book has 15 chapters. Which
Yeah.
one is your favorite and why? And we'll come to some of those specific chapters and what's in it.
Yeah, this would probably, yeah, this is a hard question because I kind of like all of them. And each one of them, I wish there was something I could, I think in a lot of them, I wish I could have kept writing more stuff because there's a lot more that I wanted to say. So ones that I really enjoyed writing and enjoyed reading afterwards, I like chapter 4, which is on perception. Chapter 4 is can you trust your senses? And I talk a lot about how different kinds of sensory inputs are very quickly broken down into features. Visual input is broken down into features, and that at each step we lose some of the information from what's out there in the world. So what's represented, if we're looking at something, the visual input is going to be reflected on the back of your retina, right? But at each step of processing, you lose some of that direct connection with the world. And what you'd get instead is processed information that helps you make decisions about stuff. Your brain needs that information to be processed so that it can act on it. So at every point, we're looking at this trade-off between losing some information and not getting things perfect, but also processing information in ways that helps us use it more quickly and more effectively. So I really like chapter 4. I like the chapter that I wrote on concepts and also on inductive reasoning. That's the one on, what was the title of that one? Predicting the Future, which is on the science of induction and inferential reasoning. I'd say that's probably my second favorite chapter. When I reread it, that's one that I wish I could have written several different times. There's a lot more I wanted to say about induction because in my view, and this is something that I teach about too, induction and inference is like the core of the thinking process. That's where we take memories and perceptions and all of the stuff that's coming in from the outside world, and we transform it and then try to predict what's coming next. So whether it's what's coming next in terms of, what word I'm going to say next or what words you're going to say next when we're having a conversation. That's predicting the future just a few seconds. Predicting how someone's going to behave when you ask them a question, or predicting how someone's going to behave if you confront them about something. Trying to assess how different objects are going to move. All of that has to do with inductive inference, observing things and then making predictions and inferences. And so that kind of subtle predicting the future, I think, is really at the heart of what our brains and minds have evolved to do in terms of thinking. A lot of the other stuff that we get from that, like complex problem solving and language use, sort of comes from this basic ability to be able to predict exactly what's coming next. And then act on it. We want to be able to act on it.
Yeah, Paul. And for example, by the way, these chapters, can we trust ourselves? Is a question I asked after reading your chapter, and you talk about predicting the future. I asked myself, is it possible, especially looking at the last 17, 18 months? There's a chapter on how we decide, and I want to come to that, but I want to go back to the first chapter. When you talk about your college friend, and she has an accident, and she has a severe accident where there is some damage to the brain, and the surgeons have to remove a part of it, and then she cures, she heals, and you meet her after many years, and she's a very different person. I mean, in terms of her physical appearance, she's the same person, but in terms of her behavior, in terms of how she responds, how she communicates, she's changed a lot. And you've written about the specific, for example, the ability to discern what to say, what not to say. what to
Yeah.
reveal and what not to reveal. So using that example, give us a sense of what are you trying to say there?
So I think I like that. I like using that example because it reflects on, I reflect on a lot of different things when I think about that. First of all, I think that's one of the things that got me interested in cognitive psychology in the first place. So psychology is a really broad topic, and it's a really broad field, right? I mean, there's clinical applications, there's social psychology and animal behavior, neuroscience. There's a lot of different aspects to psychology, but I got interested in cognitive psychology and understanding how the mind works and understanding how that is driven by brain processes, and in large part because of that. So this is, for those of you that haven't had a chance to read the book, though I do hope you get a copy soon. This is a story that I talk about. This happened when I was in high school going into college and university. So I would have been probably around 17 or 18 maybe when it happened. And it was a friend, it was a close friend of ours, friend of the family. And this is someone I knew in high school. And during her final year, her senior year, we did not attend the same high school, but this was someone that we knew. She was driving alone. She was in a car accident, and it was a fairly severe head-on collision with a tree, and it caused her to damage the front part of her forehead. And what I write about is that it damaged the orbital frontal cortex, which is the part of the frontal cortex in the brain that's right behind the eye. So that's the orbital part. The prefrontal cortex, the front of the cortex, this orbital frontal cortex, has been implicated in a lot of things like planning, inhibitory control. So being able to decide which one of the impulses or behaviors that you want to carry out. So you may have lots of things you want to do when you meet somebody. There's lots of things you could say, lots of ways you could behave, and some of them are more appropriate than others, but maybe there are lots of different possibilities and you need to select one, right? You need to be able to choose the appropriate thing to say. And this is a student who was planning to go on to university, planning to eventually go on to medical school, I think was one of her goals. After the accident, she was in a coma for a number of months. I don't remember now how many months it was, but it was a good 4 months where she wasn't able to communicate at all. When she did wake up, she couldn't talk. She could only sort of recognize people that she knew, we think. With time, because she was younger, her brain was able to recapture some of the function. And she was able to start speaking again, and she was able to recognize people. But she was such a different person. Now, of course, I just assumed it was because she was still recovering. And when I went away to university, then of course I hadn't seen her for a while, and maybe 2 years had gone by. And then at some point, I think maybe when I was home for the summer, or maybe it was the next year, we had come in contact and we had visited the family, and it was remarkable how much better she had gotten in terms of her ability to speak and interact. You wouldn't have guessed that she had an accident unless you knew that what the scar on her forehead was from. But her personality had changed completely. So there was a lot of inappropriate comments sometimes, and I don't mean that they were wildly inappropriate. They were just sometimes the wrong things to say. Or she would forget
And
things,
it was in
or
contrast
she
to her
would make
earlier
things up
personality.
sometimes.
It was in contrast to her earlier
Yeah.
personality.
Absolutely. It was a complete contrast. And it was really like a different person. She looked the same. She spoke the same. She sounded the same, but the personality was different. Not bad, just different. And I was really taken by the fact that kind of damage could change a person's personality. And that really got me interested in the connection between the brain and the mind and behavior. And so that's one of the reasons I decided to study psychology, which was not my original goal in college and university. I think I initially wanted to maybe go to medical school, then probably thought about other kind of topics, chemistry at some point. And then I thought, I really want to study psychology because I want to understand the difference between, the connection between the brain and the mind and the behaviors. So that was one of the things that got me interested in that. I write also about it in the book because it gives me a a way to talk about how these different areas of the brain control, or at least mediate or help to control different kinds of behaviors and different kinds of aspects of behavior. And in this case, the prefrontal and frontal cortex control things like, or they're heavily implicated in decision making and problem solving and planning and inhibitory control. So yes, her personality was a different one. She was a different person. Not a bad person. It wasn't like, it was a real negative change. It was just a change, and it was remarkable that accident had caused that kind of change in her behavior.
Now let's move on to the chapter 2. You talk about the history of cognitive psychology. Give us why it is so relevant in today's times. Why should one have some knowledge of for leaders, for decision makers, for individuals, for entrepreneurs, people who lead people who work with people. So practically everybody who needs to have interpersonal dynamics need to understand cognitive psychology. So give us a sense of what is cognitive psychology and why is it so relevant today?
So I think it's, I give a lot of history. So again, for those of you that haven't read the book, the second chapter sort of gives an overview of cognitive psychology as a field. But maybe for the first half of that chapter, I talk about the history of cognitive psychology and experimental psychology. I think it's an interesting topic because, and I think it's important for people to know because it's a relatively new science in the broad scheme of things. The way in which we understand cognitive psychology and psychology now is relatively recent. The biological sciences, have a longer history. The chemical sciences and physical sciences have a longer history. People's understanding of the mind and behavior has a very long history. But the field of cognitive psychology, that is to say, using instruments to measure performance, instruments to measure things like your reaction time to make a decision, or instruments to measure the way in where your eyes are looking when you're reading something, so eye tracking. Those things are relatively recent. And so understanding the way in which those theories came about, I think, helps you understand some of the claims that I want to make later in this book. So helps to understand why it is that your memory doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. So one of the earliest topics in cognitive psychology is understanding the limits of your short-term memory. How many things can you remember in one, in one unit? Turns out the answer is about 7. You can remember about 7 or 8 things without having to drop something. So a list of 7 words, or a list of 7 numbers, or 7 ideas, or 7 concepts, or 7 people. You can get more than that if you group them together. So that's one of the earliest findings in cognitive psychology. So those kinds of limits. In some of the other chapters later on, when I talk about perception and attention, some of that research comes from this early era of cognitive psychology in the 1950s and the 1960s in the US and Canada, in the UK, in Europe. A lot of people were working on some of these same questions. What are the limits of perception? How many how many different sources of information can you listen to? That's a really relevant topic. I mean, here we are using modern 21st century technology on Zoom to be able to talk to people all over the place. And I'm trying to pay attention to, your visual signals. We're trying to pay attention to each other, how we look when we're trying to talk. You've probably all noticed, those of you that are spend a lot of time on Zoom, that there are some limits, right? You tend to talk over people more often. Because you don't quite get all of the information about when they're about to speak. So a conversation on Zoom is different than a conversation in person because we're missing some of that information. So that's one of the things that early cognitive psychologists were really interested in, was how many things can you pay attention to at one point? What do you need to carry on a conversation? You need visual, you need eye contact, visual information, people's hand movements, their speaking patterns. We can do that naturally when we're talking in person. And sometimes that does get lost when we're on Zoom. We're getting better at it. But Zoom conversations aren't as easy to have as in-person conversations. But what we're talking about, the limits of a Zoom conversation, are things that cognitive psychologists were interested in the 1930s and the 1940s when they wanted to study how pilots could communicate with each other in a noisy environment while they're flying a plane. So I think it's important to know that history because we're still asking and trying to answer some of the same general questions about behavior and about how we interact with different kinds of technology. Oh, I think you might be on mute, Dr. Batra.
While I'm a pro, I do this twice a week, but still sometimes I forget to unmute
Yes.
myself. You're so right, because what you said is actually true. So I said I was going to take the questions at the end of the day, but there's one question that has come in right now. I feel like taking it. It's from Mandadi Saradi, if I got the name right. Good evening. Think and act, which is more predominant? Given the choice, which is preferably thinking or acting? My view is, it's not either or. You must think and act. So obviously thinking should precede act. That's how it should be. And at least the new president of the United States of America believes in thinking and acting. I can't say about the last one, but I'd let Paul answer that.
It's a great question. So one of the topics that they're both important, right? So you say which is more predominant. I think that depends on what you're looking at. So if we're looking at the outcomes, we're looking at the actions, we're looking at behaviors, but every behavior that you choose has kind of thinking behind it. Now, sometimes it's more deliberative. And Kahneman talks about this in his sort of landmark Thinking Fast and Slow book. We can make fast decisions based on access to our memories and based on access to heuristics, and we can make slower decisions when we take time to deliberate. Although those are two different ways of thinking, they use the same underlying processes, right? They both use memory. They both use attention. They both use working memory. Sometimes you use your language to mediate some of that stuff. So they're both going to use the same underlying processes. A fast action still has a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. You may not be aware of it. One of the examples I taught, so in my view, and I think in a lot of psychologists' view, the brain has evolved primarily to coordinate actions. That's what our brain does. Now, we as humans have a lot of stuff we can do with our brains, right? We use language to communicate with other people, but it's really evolved to be able to coordinate actions. So you say that which is given the choice, thinking and action, your brain is designed to act. It's designed to move you around and to perceive things and then act towards those things. As humans, we've evolved the ability to slow down a little bit and use language to be able to act on more complex behaviors. And so the thinking process is important for those more complex decisions, but we're still acting really quickly. One of the examples I use in class a lot is that if somebody throws an object at you, whether it's a ball or a rock or a book. So if I throw a book at someone, right, you don't need to know what the book is to be able to get out of the way. Your brain is quickly going to act, and you don't need to think about why somebody threw something at you, what they're throwing at you, and all of those things. You just know enough to be able to put your hand up and stop the object from coming towards you, or catch a ball or something like that. So we have a lot of actions that we can do really quickly without thinking about it, but we're still thinking about it, right? There's still those underlying cognitive processes going on. So given the choice, it's going to depend on the environment. Somebody's throwing something at you, you want to act. Somebody's moving towards you quickly, you want to act. You've got two choices to make a decision about. You do need to act, but there's going to be some thinking processes behind that. And even in a slower, more deliberative decision, it's going to use a lot of the same underlying processes. It's going to use memory and attention and perception. It's going to use language and concepts. So yeah, that's a great question. And I think it just really depends on the scenario, and it depends on the environment. I hope that answered the question.
Absolutely, I think it does. And now let me go into, some of the chapters in the book. You have a chapter on understanding the brain. How do we understand the brain? How do we understand our own brain? Forget other people. How do we make sure that we understand why we do certain things, why we make certain decisions, why we like certain people, why is it a certain coffee shop that we like to visit every day? So give us a sense on how we can understand the brain. And is there a playbook to doing that?
So there's a lot of, you raise a lot of good, I like the examples you use, why we like to go to a certain coffee shop. One of the things your brain does really well is store information based on perception, and then re-experience that information, so reinterpret that information. So if you step into an environment, you make a note of what's around, you see what's around, you hear what's around, and then you try to store information as you go, right? So you try to remember things or store new memories, and that's what your brain is doing. It's coordinating that information, and it's trying to be able to use that information for some future event. You walk back into the coffee shop again, all of that stuff is re-experienced. Those neural connections are now a little bit faster. They're a little bit more closely connected, a little bit more densely connected. And doing the same thing, like building a habit or going to the same area or rereading a book, is going to reactivate some of those same neural connections. There's an expression from sort of some of the earlier days of neuroscience and the neuroscience of learning, where it's something like neurons that fire together wire together. So the more times these neurons fire, they get the connections between them get stronger. And as those connections get stronger, the faster you can do that behavior, or the better you can do that behavior, or the more familiarly, it's a hard word to say, you can do that behavior, right? So as those neurons continue to fire in synchrony, or fire at the same time, or fire in the same way, or in the same context, they strengthen their connections together. So if you keep going to the same coffee shop and having a good experience, that's going to reinforce it. So that's basic reinforcement learning. And that's one of the things your brain does, is basic reinforcement learning. The more times you do something, whether there's positive reinforcement or whether it's associative learning, it's associating things together, the better you're able to do those things in the future. So understanding that really helps.
And Paul, when I was preparing for this, I'm reading your book, and I'm saying, I'm sure, and you thank your wife and your two children. Of course, you thank people. Then you thank Peppermint, if I've got the name right, of cat, right?
Yes.
And I must be thinking, you must be judging your wife, judging not in the way of judging, but being the kind of psychologist you are, or somebody who's always analyzing things and trying to make sense and trying to think why it happens. You must be always judging your children, your wife, your colleagues, your students, your friends. Does that happen to you?
I find that being around a lot of, being around my family, of course, well, we've been around each other a lot more over the last 495 days.
Seems like you're counting days, Paul.
Yes, well, it's a joke that we have, especially with my younger daughter. She's like, "You're just trying to flex that you can count the number of days since the lockdown." Because we're just trying to realize how many days we've been all working from home. So bigger context here. I work as a professor, obviously, at a university, and I teach online now. We're going to be teaching in person, but so I've been doing my research online and doing my work online, writing at home. and doing teaching from my home office. And my wife also works at the university, works in the research office, and she's been doing all of her work from a home office. And both of my daughters, one of them is in university. She just finished second year. The other one finished her grade 11 in high school. And we did almost everything online. So we've been sort of home together for a long time, observing each other's behaviors and thinking about how things work and how things don't work. And I think a lot of us, certainly me, but I think all four of us, spend a lot of time just thinking about how things have changed and how we can do things differently, how we can, how one way of doing things works and how another way of doing things doesn't work, how our certain habits have grown and changed over this last year and a half. I joke a little bit about in the book and also sometimes when I'm lecturing about Peppermint the cat. So this is, I don't know how many of you have pets at home, but I kind of thought the cat was going to get tired of having us working from home for the last year and a half. But if anything, it's sort of gotten worse. She's become even more affectionate, more. She seems to love every single day of having us home. And I think people who are home with their dogs, home with their cats or their pets have probably experienced a lot of the same thing. I've noticed her behaviors have changed and sort of the interaction between what she tries to get us to do, feed her at certain times, and what we try to get her to do, to get her to not bother us at certain times. You just kind of observe these things. And I guess as a psychologist, it's not so much that I'm judging. I just observe these things and try to think about how they fit into a context of how the mind works and how the brain works. And it's a view of things that I haven't often had. At the beginning of our discussion, I was talking about how the challenges of doing so many things online and doing so many things by Zoom. And of course, that's something that I wouldn't have thought about until now. Or until this sort of current era of doing things on Zoom, the way everything looks the same, the way you do 4 or 5 different classes if you're a student from the same laptop. My younger daughter doing high school, most of it being online from her bedroom, right? It's just an unusual circumstance, and most of us haven't really planned to do classes online. I haven't really planned to do high school for an entire year from a laptop in the desk in your bedroom at home. It's not something that most of us have planned to do, but we adjust to it. And so I've done a lot of observation of how people have sometimes adjusted to some things well and not other things. So yeah, I do that a lot. I try to watch what people are doing and think about what people are doing. So I don't remember if that was the original question you asked. I think I started at once you brought up my cat, once you brought up Peppermint the cat, I started thinking about all of those things that I've been surrounded by. It's one of the reasons I think a lot of us are looking forward to being back on campus and back in the classroom. It'll be a change of context. I really like working from home, and I wrote most of this book even before the pandemic. I did almost all of the writing at home. That's where I do most of my writing work and most of my thinking work. But it'll be good to have a change, do the teaching on campus,
Absolutely.
do my meetings on campus, and then do my writing back at home.
Absolutely. Now, before I bring in my editorial colleague, Kavi Bhandari, who'd ask you a question, I want to ask you, can we trust our sense? You have a chapter and you said it's your favorite chapter. Can we really trust our sense? Because we do make mistakes. We have biases, as you explain in the book. And you also say that memory is an imperfect process. You have a chapter devoted to that. So in that sense, can we trust our sense and our memory?
So yeah, both of those are similar chapters in that regard. Both of them sort of start off with a claim that, we can't trust our senses, or memory is imperfect. What I try to do in those chapters is to start off with the question, can we trust our senses? And then to show all of the ways in which we shouldn't be able to trust our senses, right? Because we don't perceive everything that's in front of us. We miss information all the time. Even right now, as we're having this conversation, I'm paying attention to what you and I are talking about. But of course, there's other people on the call. I can see that there's question and answer, little, alerts coming up. I can see things in the chat. So I try not to pay attention to that, but I still notice it.
Right.
I'm also not paying attention to all the sounds around me, right? So there might be somebody outside on the street. The window is to my left in my office. And as people walk on the street, I can sometimes hear them talking. Right now, I don't know what they're talking about. So I've missed that piece of information. That's the good part of not being able to trust your senses, is being able to screen out information that's not currently relevant. It doesn't matter if there's a conversation happening on the street below my window, because it's not what I'm talking about right now. I don't need to know what they're talking about. And so I don't even notice it unless I spend a few extra minutes, like even right now. Now I suddenly realize there's sounds outside because I started talking about it. So not trusting your senses, yeah, it seems like we shouldn't trust our senses, but we have no choice to. Right? I mean, we do trust our senses because that's the information we're given. All of the illusions that we have are sometimes, so I talk about the moon illusion, for example, the way in which the moon or the sun looks bigger at the horizon than it does overhead. That's a conflict between our expectations and what we actually directly perceive, or the image that's on our retina. It's only when there's a conflict between things that we realize that we're not perceiving things exactly as they are in the world. For the most part, we're perceiving the things that we need to be able to act on them. So we have no choice but to trust our senses. And the same is true of our memory. It's not perfect, but that's a good thing. If we remembered everything, we would have a lot more information to screen out. So it's really better to be able to leave behind a lot of the details and pay attention to the things that are important, the things that help us make decisions, or the things that help us guide our actions.
Yeah. My last question is, before I bring in Kavir, you have a chapter on predicting the future.
Yeah.
I mean, is it really possible to predict the future?
Yeah, it is in the sense that we're predicting or making inferences, which are predictions about what's going to come next. So again, just like in the earlier chapters, it might sound kind of fanciful to say predict the future, right? But that's what we do pretty much all the time. I mean, that's most of what our brain is doing. As I said earlier in our conversation, our brains have evolved to be able to guide our actions, to take information from the world and to be able to choose the right course of action. Whether that's, which direction to move, which direction to walk, or what words to say, or who to pay attention to, you're predicting what's going to come next in the next few seconds. If we couldn't predict the future, it would be really difficult to know how to behave. Right? You wouldn't know what to say next, or you wouldn't know who to pay attention to, because you wouldn't know what words are coming next in someone's sentence, or you wouldn't know which direction an object is coming towards you. You need to be able to calculate trajectories. Even my cat, Peppermint, if any of you have cats or dogs, you throw a Frisbee to a dog or a ball to a dog, it jumps up. It knows where the ball is going to be. So it's predicted the future. The dog says, well, the dog doesn't say. The dog behaves in a way that suggests that it can orient its actions to plan exactly where that ball is going to be when it jumps up for it.
These are things that they're preconditioned to. What about the things that they're not preconditioned to?
So they're not preconditioned so the basic underlying objects, these are things that they have these behaviors. They've evolved these behaviors. So a cat, and I use one of the reasons I like using a cat as an example, and I think I even say this directly in the book, cats don't think. They're not thinking the way we're thinking. They're behaving. They're behaving in accord to stimuli and then making decisions, but they're still predicting the future. They're taking what's available in their environment and making predictions about where to be, where to position themselves when they're going after something that they're going to attack. Or going after an object that they're going to grab. Yes, they don't have a lot of choice because they're cats, right? I mean, their brains are designed and evolved, specialized to be able to take visual input and auditory input and move towards it. But they're still doing some sort of direct short-term prediction about where to move, where to act. Our brains have evolved language, and we use our brains to be able to predict what words are coming next and to predict what words mean and what concepts they activate. But it's the same underlying process. It's the same associative memory, as you suggested. It's some of these aspects or some of these components are innate. So the ability to create associative memories is one that all of us have. The ability to be able to associate stimuli that co-occur with other stimuli, objects that co-occur with other objects, or behaviors that co-occur with other behaviors. It's a basic aspect of biological intelligence, whether it's a cat or a spider or a human. We're all using this basic idea of being able to take information and then plan an action in the future. So predicting the future is what we need to do. It's one of the reasons that's probably my favorite chapter, is that's what thinking is designed to do.
Beautiful. And entrepreneurs do it because they create solutions which are futuristic, which solve problems.
Yes.
So yes. Now, I'll let Kavi ask his question, and then I'll bring in one question from Naresh Rao and the second question again from Mandari Saradi. But Kavi, go ahead and ask your question to Paul.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Mr. Minda.
Good morning.
I just had one question. As you mentioned, psychology is a vast topic. It's a vast subject. I wanted to just ask you that during the pandemic, which branch of psychology is the most beneficial right now? Because people are talking about psychosis, neurosis, they're talking about social psychology, and they're talking about depression, anxiety, fear, uncertainty. So which branch of psychology is the most beneficial right now?
That is a great question. And I have to say, I don't know if I can really come down to, I don't know if I can give you a clear answer on which branch of psychology I think is the most important right now. From my perspective, I would argue that social psychology or cognitive psychology would be critically important now. And one of the reasons I think they're critically important is there is a lot of uncertainty right now. You mentioned uncertainty.
Yes.
We just don't know. And as we were just, as Dr. Batra and I were just discussing, as humans and other animals place a great premium on being able to predict what's coming next. And none of us have any training for experiencing a pandemic in real time with information coming in so quickly. Humans have been through pandemics and plagues. I mean, this is not unusual to have a case where a virus is going to, is going to propagate in a dangerous way. This has happened before. Plagues have happened before. What hasn't happened before, I don't think, is that many of us across the world have access to so much information about it. And that's where I think cognitive psychology and maybe to an extent social psychology are really important. Being able to understand and navigate how you deal with uncertainty. How can you evaluate information? At any given time, I mean, all of us know at any given time there's conflicting information about how to deal with COVID vaccines, for example. So every country has different policies. One of the things that we ran into in Canada, and I don't know if this was the case in India as well, is that we started off with a variety of different vaccination protocols. So for us, one of the first ones we had access to was the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, and that's what my first vaccination shot was. Shortly afterwards, people became worried about blood clotting, very rare side effect, but serious one. At some point after my first AstraZeneca shot, Canadian government decided to stop giving AstraZeneca for first shots. So they told most of us that had received AstraZeneca, you know what, get a different vaccine. So a lot of us were like, wait a minute, we hadn't prepared to get two different kinds of vaccines. So I got an AstraZeneca shot, and then I got a Pfizer vaccine, mRNA vaccine later on, at an interval that was not something that I was expecting to do. So these are things that last year I didn't even know we would have a vaccine. When we knew we would have a vaccine, we assumed we would get one shot and then another shot. I didn't expect to have one shot of one vaccine and then a variable time course to get a second vaccine. That kind of uncertainty and the different kinds of information that come along with it, I think it's just, that's a lot of information to deal with. And being able to keep it straight is something that I think we all need to, it helps to be able to understand how humans and how all of us can evaluate information and make decisions and judge which information is going to be the correct one. And so that's, I guess, from my perspective, understanding cognitive and social psychology in this context, I think is critically important.
Thank you
So
so
maybe
much.
it's not the most important branch,
And
but I
you-
think it's really important.
And Paul, I just wanted to, kind of, Kavi stole the question from me, not in the entirety, as a very intelligent and relevant question. But I keep saying that we don't even know what we don't know.
That's right.
We know what we know. We don't know what we don't know, but we don't even know what we don't know. Right?
That's right.
So I think that's the realm we are in right now. And there are two questions. I'll take that before I ask my last question. One is, from Naresh Rao. He says, what is the role of language in thinking? If someone is multilingual, is it an advantage or disadvantage when it comes to thinking? I'll give you my. I think we all tend to think in one single language. We have a primary language of thinking, of communicating, of assimilating. I think if that primary language, and at best there is one more secondary language. So anything that happens in this has more impact. Anything that happens in other languages would. But I'm not an expert. Let's get Paul to answer.
So that's a great question. So the role of language in thinking is really to be able to give us more time to make decisions. It's to be able to communicate information to others. It's to be able to summarize and communicate information to ourselves. One of the points that I make early in some of the earlier chapters in this text, and this is particularly true for perception, attention, and memory, is that the basic underlying components of our attention systems and our perception systems, we share a lot of that with non-human animals. So our visual processes, the visual process of the cat, when I go like this, it's because the cat is sleeping on the couch right over here. So the visual components of my cat and my visual system are a lot, there's a lot of similarity, right? The receptors work in the same way. The networks work in a lot of the same way. So the direct connection between vision and action is shared among many different species. What humans have is the ability to summarize that information with language. So it gives us a way to have an additional hierarchical level, a broader level of abstraction. We can think about a whole class of objects by giving it a name. That name might denote something that would behave the same way towards. So once you can name something, once you can use language to explain to something, you can offload a little bit of that direct cognitive stimulus and response cognition that non-human animals can do by explaining things to yourself. So that's one role of language in thinking. It gives you the ability to think about more because it gives you the ability to abstract more information in a single term. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation if we didn't have the ability to abstract information and to use words as symbols for whole ideas. So I can use one or two words, or Dr. Batra and I were discussing things. We can use a single word or a term or a phrase to refer to an entire class of objects or an entire class of ideas. Or when I was answering the earlier question and I talked about social psychology, that's a huge field, and I can use the term social psychology as a way to label that entire field. And I assume that those of you that are listening know what that means, right? We share some of that communication. Second part of the question here is about multilingual. So multilingual, in this case, bilingual, multilingual, you've got access to other ways to describe things. Now, there has been some work, some cognitive psychological work, which is sometimes a little controversial, which would suggest that people who are multilingual, or bilingual at least, have some basic cognitive advantages. And that is that they can, if you speak 2 or 3 languages, you find yourself switching between those 2 or 3 languages, you may develop some degree of inhibitory control. because you can inhibit the language you're not using so that you can respond in the language that you are using, and that there's some additional cognitive flexibility that comes with that. The more recent research would suggest that's pretty limited, that there aren't too many general advantages that come with being multilingual. And when I say general advantages, I just mean that it doesn't correspond to having a better memory in general, and it doesn't correspond to having better abilities to perceive or better cognitive flexibility in general. Being multilingual means you have access to more concepts. You have access to more ways to describe things. And I think that's something that's generally true. I can't think of any research that would suggest it's a disadvantage. In my book, it would be always an advantage to be able to have more than one language to speak or to read in.
And the second question from Mandadi Saradi. You were talking of predictions. How is it different from statistical models or even astrology? Please elaborate.
So statistical models, great example. So one of the suggestions in a lot of neural network modeling or machine learning is that these are ways in which you can build very complex systems that do what our brain does. That is statistical learning. So statistical learning in this case means taking some input, acquiring a function, and then predicting some outcome. Obviously, the simplest kind of models would be these sort of linear regression models that most people who are familiar with statistics can use. Machine learning models and computational neural network models depend on a lot of these same things. So being able to take some input, generate a function to predict some output. And that's what our brains do. It's, statistical learning in this case is sort of the basic underpinning of cognition. Taking information, tracking that information, and then determining how that information fits together. Whether it's acquiring a new language, acquiring a new skill, paying attention to behaviors. A lot of this has to do with tracking the statistics, tracking the occurrence of things, the co-occurrence of things, and the relationship between something that happens first and something that comes after. You mentioned astrology. Any kind of predictive pattern. So astrology in this case, meaning using sort of celestial celestial action to predict what's going to happen next. It seems to me that although we might argue that there isn't a clear mechanism for how celestial action can guide your own behaviors, paying attention to things in context. So paying attention to time of day or paying attention to the time of year is going to bring back certain memories. So if you pay attention to the time of year and you behave certain ways or you think certain ways at different times of year, those things are going to co-occur and you're going to notice those relationships. Now, whether or not you attribute it to a celestial event or not, it may have to do with your own particular your own particular circumstance, your own particular upbringing, your own particular cultural background. Those kind of attributions might be social in nature, but the basic idea of noticing the context and the influence of context on behavior, that's something that's fairly well grounded in the way the brain works.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's fascinating to talk to you and talk to you about what is in your book, but we overshot the time by 3 minutes. I would request you to show a copy of your book. I promise you I'll buy a lot of books and read a lot of books. I get a lot of books, but this book is fascinating. Especially I love the cover. And I told Paul that one of my friends, seeing my post on Facebook, actually came home and said, I want to read this book, and took the book from me. And I had to read it online. I had to read a PDF copy to prepare for this. So thank you so much, Paul, for talking to us, for writing this book. I'm sure it'll be a big hit, and I'm sure it'll help people make better decisions and live better lives, especially with a lot of fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. So congratulations on writing this book. and I would like you to show a copy of the book so that
Yes, for
viewers
sure.
get.
So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you all. This has been a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. So yes, the book, How to Think, understanding the way we decide, remember, and make sense of the world. And this can be purchased online anywhere. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it direct. It was first publication in at the end of April. It'll be republished again in North America in February of 2022. And so, yeah, you can buy it anywhere books are sold. And if you found any of this conversation interesting, yeah, by all means, I hope you pick up a copy and read it. You can follow. You can follow me on social if you're interested. I usually comment on some of this kind of stuff as well. So thanks for this opportunity. This has been really
That is all
interesting.
mine.
Great.
Thank you. This was Mr. John Paul Minda, author of How to Think, talking to BW Business World and BW Wellbeing World. If you missed this interview, you can read it on the BW Wellbeing World site and the businessworld.in site next week, or you can watch it on the YouTube channel of BW Business World. Thank you so much, Paul. We wish you luck. Have a great day. Thank you so much.